The moment Perry Lockhart's massive body hit the dry Arizona earth, the sound was like a felled oak striking the ground, heavy, final, and terrifying in its completeness. Delia Barrett heard it from 40 yards away, and something cold shot straight through her chest before her mind even registered what she was seeing. She had been crouched near the creek bank, her worn leather satchel open beside her, her fingers carefully stripping the dried seed pods from a cluster of Mormon tea plants she'd found growing between the rocks. Her hands were quick and practiced, the way they always were when she worked with plants, moving with a kind of intelligence that lived in her fingertips rather than her conscious thought. But the sound of that fall cut through everything: the bird song, the distant lowing of cattle, the warm buzz of late afternoon, and snapped her upright like a wire pulled taut. She saw him flat on his face in the red dust, his horse standing a few feet away, the reins trailing, the animal turning its great head back to look at the man on the ground with what seemed, even from a distance, like a kind of sorrow. Delia was running before she made the decision to run. She covered the distance in seconds, her boots kicking up small puffs of red dust, her satchel swinging hard against her hip. She dropped to her knees beside him and pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, and what she felt made her jaw tighten. His pulse was there, but it was weak and terrifyingly fast, a hummingbird heartbeat, all speed and no strength. His skin was hot in a way that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun beating down on them both. She rolled him carefully onto his back, and the face she uncovered was one she recognized, because everyone within 40 miles of Canon Creek recognized Perry Lockhart. He was a big man. There was no way around it. Broad through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of hands that looked like they'd been built for hard work rather than delicacy, with a jaw that could have been cut from the same red sandstone that made up the canyon walls to the north. He was, by most accounts, one of the most capable ranchers in the territory, a man who had, in the past 3 years, turned a nearly bankrupt spread into one of the most productive cattle operations south of the Mogollon Rim. He was also, in this moment, completely helpless, and the color of his face scared her badly. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge at the corners. His breathing was shallow and labored, each inhale pulling harder than the last. His eyes were closed, and when she pressed her palm flat to his forehead, she felt the heat radiating off him like a stove door left open. "Perry Lockhart," she said sharply, not because she expected him to answer, but because the sound of his name said firmly sometimes pulled unconscious people back toward the surface. "Perry, stay with me." Nothing. His chest kept working, but just barely. She had been gathering herbs that afternoon because she always gathered herbs. It was what she did, who she was, the thing that defined her existence in this isolated corner of Arizona territory in the year 1887. She was Delia Barrett, the herb woman of Canon Creek, and in a territory where the nearest doctor was 22 miles away in the town of Harlow, she was very often the only thing that stood between a sick person and a bad end. She had not started out planning to be indispensable. She had started out running. But that was a story for another time. Right now, the only story that mattered was the man dying in the dust in front of her and what she was going to do about it. She opened her satchel, and her hands moved through it with the rapid, certain efficiency of long habit. She was reading him the way she read her plants, cataloging the signs, matching them to her knowledge, building a picture of what was happening inside his body that no one without her specific education could have built from the outside. The fever was extreme, probably 4 or 5 days in building to this point. The rapid, weak pulse suggested his heart was working too hard trying to maintain blood pressure it no longer had the resources to maintain. The bluish tinge around the lips was the thing that worried her most. It suggested the infection, whatever it was, had begun affecting his circulation. She checked his hands quickly, pressing on his fingernails and watching the color return, and what she saw confirmed her fear. This was not just fever. This was blood poisoning or something very close to it, and a man in this condition left in the sun on the ground of the open range without treatment would be dead before sundown. She looked up. She looked at the horse. She looked in every direction and saw nothing but the vast, indifferent landscape of the Arizona Territory stretching away from her in every direction, red rock and scrub, and the pale gold of autumn grass, and a sky so blue it looked like someone had polished it. No one was coming. There was no one to send for the doctor. It was just her and the man, and everything she carried in her satchel. She had treated worse. She told herself this firmly because the alternative was panic, and she did not permit herself panic. She had learned that lesson the hard way in a past that lived in her bones like an old brake that ached in cold weather. She got to work. 3 years before this afternoon, Delia Barrett had arrived in Canon Creek in the way that many people arrived at the edges of civilization in the Arizona Territory, by accident and by desperation, which in her case amounted to the same thing. She had come west from St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1884, carrying 2 trunks, a significant amount of grief, and a knowledge of medicinal herbs and plant remedies so thorough and so detailed that it had taken her nearly 15 years of study and practice to accumulate. Her mother had been a healer not formally trained, but possessed of a knowledge passed down through 3 generations of women in their family who had lived in the Ozark Hill country and learned from the land the way other women learned from books. Her mother had taught her everything, and when her mother died, Delia had found that the grief of losing her was made slightly more bearable by the fact that she still had her mother's knowledge alive inside her. Every plant she touched was a conversation with her mother. Every remedy she mixed was a way of keeping her mother present. She had left St. Louis because of a man, which was the most ordinary and the most humiliating explanation she could have offered, and so she rarely offered it. His name was Richard Farrow, and he had been a banker's son who had courted her for 2 years, charmed her parents and her neighbors and everyone who met them together. And then, 6 weeks before their wedding, she had discovered that the courtship had been a mechanism for accessing the small but significant parcel of land her father had left her. Richard had no actual interest in her. He had considerable interest in the mineral rights attached to her property. By the time she understood the full dimensions of the betrayal, she had already signed documents she should not have signed, and the land was effectively beyond her reach. She left because staying felt like slowly suffocating inside the wreckage of her own humiliation. She took the train west, and then a stagecoach, and then another stagecoach, and then a wagon driven by a territorial supply man named Hodges who was going as far as the settlement at Canon Creek. And that was where the wagon lost a wheel, and Hodges said he was staying put until he could get it fixed, and Delia stepped out onto the main street of Canon Creek and looked at it, and something in her chest went still and quiet in a way she recognized as a kind of answer. She stayed because the land needed her, or more precisely because the people on the land needed what she knew. In a settlement this isolated, with the doctor so far, with the harshness of the territory creating an endless stream of injuries and illnesses and fevers, her knowledge of plant medicine was not a curiosity or a hobby. It was survival. Within 6 months of her arrival, she had treated snake bites and infected wounds and difficult childbirths and respiratory sicknesses, and a dozen other conditions that would have ended badly without her intervention. She built a small cabin on the edge of town, cultivated a garden of medicinal plants supplemented by what she gathered in the wild, and became, in the slow and certain way that necessary people become important, someone the entire settlement depended on. She was also deeply, deliberately alone. Not lonely, that was the distinction she made carefully in her own mind. She had acquaintances and the gratitude of the people she helped and the deep, sustaining company of her work. But she kept herself at a professional distance from everyone, because the one time she had allowed herself to be close to someone, she had ended up signing over her father's land. She was not going to make that mistake again. She had been doing an excellent job of keeping that distance right up until the afternoon that Perry Lockhart fell off his horse in front of her. Now Kneeling in the red dust with his head carefully elevated on her rolled-up jacket, Delia moved through the contents of her satchel with the controlled urgency of someone who has prepared for exactly this kind of moment without ever hoping it would come. She had yarrow, which she always carried because yarrow was the foundational herb of emergency field medicine. It could reduce fever, support circulation, and slow inflammation. She had elderberry syrup in a small sealed bottle, made from berries she'd harvested and processed herself in late August and potent enough that she rationed it carefully. She had a tin of dried golden seal root, which was her most powerful tool against the kind of deep systemic infection she suspected was driving what she was seeing in his body. She had willow bark for the fever. She had peppermint oil to support the respiratory function. What she needed first was water, and she had that. She'd been working near the creek. She went back for it quickly, filling her tin cup in her leather water carrier, and returned to find him in the same position, breathing the same shallow, labored breaths, completely unaware of her or anything. She brewed a fast cold infusion of the yarrow and golden seal in her tin cup using water from the creek, working efficiently, using the small folding knife on her belt to crush the golden seal root to powder against a flat rock so it would release its constituents faster. The result would not be perfect. A proper decoction required heat and time. But she had worked with cold infusions before when fire was impractical, and done correctly they were effective enough to matter. While the infusion steeped, she used her remaining water and a cloth from her satchel to begin cooling his skin. The fever was so severe that it was itself dangerous, and until she could get something medicinal into him, the most important thing she could do was prevent it from climbing further. She moved with systematic efficiency, starting at his forehead and working down, talking to him in the low, even voice she used with patients who were unconscious or near unconscious, because she had long believed that some part of people still heard things even when the rest of them was far away. "You are going to be all right," she told him, and she believed it, because she needed to believe it to do her job properly. "You are stubborn enough to stay alive. I have heard the stories about you, Perry Lockhart, and you are not the kind of man who dies in a field." She had heard the stories. Canon Creek was small enough that everyone's story was eventually everyone's story, and Perry Lockhart's was one that had reached her in pieces over the 3 years she'd been here. The broad outline was this. He had come to the territory 6 years ago from somewhere in Texas, had arrived with not much more than a string of horses and the kind of iron-backed determination that some men were simply born with, and had spent 6 years building the Lockhart Ranch into something real. He had done it alone, without family money or connections, working with the pure leveraged force of his own stubborn competence. He was known for being fair with his hands, hard-nosed in a negotiation, completely honest in a deal, and deeply private in everything else. He was 32 years old and had never, as far as anyone in Canon Creek seemed to know, shown serious romantic interest in anyone. The women in town had opinions about this, which Delia had heard second-hand from her neighbor, Mrs. Oglesby, who kept a kind of informal accounting of everyone's romantic prospects, the way other people kept financial records. Mrs. Oglesby's theory was that Perry Lockhart was too busy building his ranch to bother with romance. Delia had thought, the one time she'd heard this theory, that building something was a very good way to avoid grieving something else, and that Perry Lockhart might have a dark past that made the work a comfortable place to hide. She had thought this because she recognized the pattern from her own life, but she had not said so, because she was not in the habit of sharing such observations. She had met him exactly twice before this afternoon, once at the general store, where he had politely stepped aside to let her reach a high shelf, and once at a community gathering where she had noticed him standing at the edge of the assembly with the specific quality of stillness that very large men sometimes use to make themselves seem smaller. Both times he had struck her as contained and serious and possessed of a kind of quiet authority that she respected without particularly thinking about it. She was thinking about it now, in the way that proximity to a person's mortality had a habit of making you think about them more clearly and more kindly than distance ever did. She checked the infusion. It was not ideal, but it would serve. The real challenge now was getting it into him when he was unconscious. She had dealt with this before, with a child who had been insensible from a fever, and with an old trapper who had been unresponsive after a rattlesnake bite. And she knew that small, careful amounts at a time, with the patient's head tilted and positioned correctly, could work. It took patience, and it was slow, and there was always a risk, but the alternative was leaving him without the medicine his body desperately needed. She worked methodically and carefully, coaxing small amounts of the yarrow and golden seal infusion past his lips and watching his throat to make sure he swallowed before giving more. It took a long time. The sun moved across the sky above her, and she ignored it. She gave him the elderberry syrup, a small amount at a careful time. She continued the cooling cloths. She kept talking to him because it felt like the right thing to do, and because she had nothing to lose by it. "Someone is going to come looking for you," she said, wringing out the cloth and applying it again to his forehead. "A man with a ranch does not disappear for an afternoon without someone noticing. Your hands will come looking. When they do, we need to get you back to your ranch, and I need to be able to keep you under treatment for several days at minimum. This is not the kind of thing that resolves in an afternoon." She paused, smoothing the cloth along his jaw, and then caught herself doing it with more care than was strictly medically necessary, and moved her hand back to a more clinical position. "You are also going to need to tell me how long you have been feeling ill, because you did not get to this point in an afternoon either, and I would very much like to know why you were out riding in this condition instead of in bed where you belong." He did not answer this, which was probably for the best, because the question had been slightly sharp. She had been working on him for nearly 2 hours when she heard the horses coming. There were 3 of them, riders moving fast, which meant they were worried, which confirmed her sense that someone had noticed his absence. She stood and shaded her eyes and watched them come, and recognized the lead rider as Hector Vega, Perry's ranch foreman, a compact, capable man from Sonora who she had treated the previous year for a badly infected hand, and who had been extravagantly grateful ever since. Hector pulled up his horse and was off it before it had fully stopped, coming toward her with his face already tightened into the expression men wore when they were prepared for bad news. "Miss Barrett," he said, and then he saw Perry on the ground, and something shifted in his face that was deeper than worry. It was the look of a man who genuinely cared about his employer. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," she said clearly. "But he is stable for the moment. I have been treating him here for 2 hours. He needs to be moved to the ranch carefully. I do not want him jostled or his head lower than his body, and he needs a doctor, but before the doctor can get here, I need to be there to continue treatment. The infection is deep and aggressive, and it needs to be managed continuously, not in intervals." Hector was already looking at his 2 riders, already solving the logistics, already the competent man she knew him to be. "We can make a stretcher from the bedrolls, tie it between 2 horses." "Do it," she said. "Gently, I mean that, Hector, gently." "Yes, ma'am." She spent the time while they built the stretcher writing out a message to send to Harlow for the doctor, giving it to the younger of the 2 riders with clear instructions, and watching him ride off with the urgent sense that she was dispatching something important into uncertainty. The doctor in Harlow was a man named Calvert, whom she had met once, and whose opinion of her practice she was not entirely sure of. Some trained doctors respected the practical medicine of the frontier. Others viewed it with contempt that she found irritating and counterproductive. She would know which kind Dr. Calvert was when he arrived, and in the meantime she intended to do what needed to be done regardless. They moved Perry to the stretcher with more care than she had expected from men who spent their lives in physical labor, and she rode alongside during the 2 miles back to the Lockhart ranch, her hand on his wrist for most of the journey, monitoring his pulse and watching his color, and once, just once, she felt his fingers move against her hand, not with any conscious intention, just the small, involuntary motion of a body that was still fighting. She held on. The Lockhart Ranch was more than she had imagined from the descriptions she'd heard. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of red rock, and the main house was built low and solid in the way of buildings meant to last rather than impress, with a wide covered porch running the full length of the front, and windows that faced south to catch the winter light. The outbuildings were clean and well maintained. The corrals were well constructed. The whole place had the feel of something built by someone who was serious about permanence. They brought Perry into the main house and into his bedroom, and Delia took over from there with the quiet authority she put on like a garment when she was practicing. A sense of complete competence that she had learned long ago was itself part of the medicine. People healed better when they believed the person caring for them knew what they were doing. She directed the positioning of the bed, the management of the room temperature, the preparation of fresh water, and the collection of what she needed from the kitchen. A good pot for proper decoctions now that she had access to a stove, clean cloth for fresh compresses, a good lamp for the hours ahead. Hector's wife, a sturdy woman named Consuelo who managed the ranch house, proved immediately invaluable. She moved with efficiency and without hysteria, found everything Delia asked for, and asked intelligent questions about what Delia was doing, and why, in a way that told Delia she had done this kind of care before. They worked together through the late afternoon and into the evening with the focused, wordless collaboration of two competent women doing necessary work. And by the time the last light was leaving the sky, Perry's color had improved slightly, and his breathing had deepened from the desperate shallow work it had been doing earlier into something that used more of his lungs. He regained partial consciousness around 8 o'clock in the evening, which was the first real indication that the treatment was holding. His eyes opened and looked at the ceiling without appearing to understand the ceiling, and then they moved to Delia, who was sitting in the chair beside his bed with a fresh decoction cooling in the tin cup beside her, and they stayed there. She looked back at him steadily, professionally, with the careful distance she maintained between herself and all her patients. "You are at your ranch," she said. "You collapsed near the creek. I found you. You are going to be all right, but you are very ill and you need to stay completely still." His mouth worked for a moment before sound came out. "Who?" His voice was destroyed, rough as gravel over rock, almost unrecognizable as a voice. "Who are you?" She was slightly surprised. "Delia Barrett. I live in Canon Creek. We have met twice." Something moved across his face that might have been an attempt to process this information, but the fever still had too much hold on him for processing to work efficiently. "The herb woman," he said. It was not unkind. It was simply the way everyone said it, as a category rather than a name. "Among other things," she said, in the same even tone, and gave him a small amount of the new decoction. He slept again after that, a deeper sleep than before, which was better. She stayed. She had not planned to stay the night, but the rhythm of proper fever management required monitoring at regular intervals, and without the doctor, there was no one else to do it, and so she did it because the man would not be safe otherwise, and because she was not capable of leaving a patient in a dangerous condition. She managed the intervals through the night, checking his pulse, adjusting the compresses, giving him medicine when he was awake enough to take it, which happened twice more in the long dark hours before dawn. The second time he was awake and coherent enough to hold a real conversation, it was past 2 in the morning and the house was completely silent around them. He opened his eyes and they were clearer this time, tracking properly, and when they found her in the chair beside the lamp they stayed. "You have been here all night," he said. It was not a question. His voice was still rough but had some substance to it now. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight his face was stripped of its usual guardedness. The fever had taken the careful composure that most adults wore over their real selves, and what was left was something more direct and more searching. "Why?" "Because you would have died otherwise," she said simply. He absorbed this. You were out there by the creek, not in town. I gather plants near the creek. I have a regular route I follow. Fortunate, he said. For you, yes, she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the direction of one. Perry Lockhart, he said, as if introducing himself. I know, I told you. I don't remember that. You were not particularly conscious. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through what his body was telling him, taking an inventory of his condition with the practical self-assessment of a man accustomed to understanding physical systems. How bad? He asked. Blood poisoning, she said directly, because she had found over years of practice that people healed better when they were told the truth. Likely from a wound that was not properly cleaned, or an infection that was given time to deepen rather than being treated early. It had been building for several days before it overtook you today. You were riding in that condition. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific acknowledgement of someone who had been doing something they knew was unwise. I had things to do, he said. You nearly had a death to undergo, she said, and then softened it slightly because he was still sick and she was not naturally harsh. People who work as hard as you tend to treat their own illnesses as interruptions rather than emergencies. It is a pattern I have seen before. You have seen this before. Many times. You are not the first stubborn rancher I have treated. Another not quite smile. His eyes were doing the thing she had noticed with other very sick people who were beginning to recover, seeing things with unusual clarity, as though the fever had burned off some ordinary opacity and left the vision underneath raw and direct. Miss Barrett, he said, yes. I would like to know, he stopped, as if the sentence required more effort than he currently had available, then continued. How you knew what to do. Out there, she considered her answer. My mother taught me, she said, and then years of practice, and a great deal of reading whenever I could get my hands on the right books. There is a substantial body of knowledge about medicinal plants that most people are not aware of because it exists largely outside the formal medical tradition. He held her gaze. You saved my life. I stabilized you, she corrected, with the precise care she always used about her own work. The medicines are doing the work of saving you. I facilitated it. There is a distinction there that I do not think matters much from where I am lying, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at her hands in her lap, and she felt something she did not entirely want to feel, a small, warm shift in the careful architecture of her distance, as if one stone in a well-built wall had been nudged slightly out of alignment. Sleep, she told him. The doctor will be here tomorrow. Dr. Calvert arrived the next morning at 11 o'clock, having ridden through the night after receiving the message, and he was not quite what Delia had expected, which was to say he was neither the contemptuous skeptic nor the enthusiastic ally she had imagined during the waiting hours. He was a methodical man of about 50, with the precise manner of someone trained in the East and transplanted to the West without ever fully reconciling those two things in himself. He came into the sick room, examined his patient, checked his pulse and his color and his breathing, reviewed the contents of Delia's satchel when she offered them, and was silent for a long time. Then he looked at her. You used golden seal, he said. Yes. Ground cold infusion initially, then a proper decoction once I had access to a stove. Combined with yarrow and elderberry. Yes, and willow bark for the fever, and peppermint oil applied to his chest for respiratory support. He was quiet again for a moment. I would have prescribed something similar, he said, if I had been here. The golden seal it is exactly the right choice for a systemic infection of this kind. Where did you learn that application? She was careful not to show her surprise at the respect in his voice, because she recognized that showing surprise would suggest she had expected less from him. A combination of my mother's teaching and several years of correspondence with a botanist in Philadelphia, she said. And my own records from cases I have treated here. You keep records, he said. Always. Would you like to see them? He said yes, which surprised her more than anything else had, and she found that Dr. Calvert was, despite his formal manner, the kind of man who genuinely valued competence wherever he found it, regardless of the form it came in. They spent an hour reviewing her case records together, while Consuelo managed Perry's medicine in the next room, and it was a conversation that Delia found unexpectedly invigorating. The first time she had spoken to someone with medical training as an equal rather than as a curiosity or an interloper. When they came back to the sick room, Perry was awake and watching the door with the look of a man who had been listening and could not decide what to make of what he'd heard. The doctor spent another half-hour with him, examined the site of what turned out to be a small puncture wound on his left forearm. A piece of wire from a fence repair 3 weeks ago, Perry admitted that he had cleaned poorly and then largely ignored and confirmed Delia's assessment in terms that were, in their precision, almost exactly what she had said to Hector the day before. "Another 12 hours without treatment, Doctor," Calvert said in the calm, factual tone of a man delivering information rather than pronouncing judgment, and the outcome would have been very different. The treatment that was administered was correct and almost certainly saved your life. He glanced at Delia as he said this. "You are in good hands, Mr. Lockhart." Perry looked at Delia. She looked back at him with her professional composure firmly in place, and she saw something in his expression that she had not seen there before, a quality of attention that was different from the acknowledgement of a patient looking at his caregiver, different from simple gratitude. It was the look of someone who had just been genuinely surprised by the dimensions of something they had assumed they had already measured. She had surprised him, not the way a clever trick surprised you, but the way a landscape surprised you when you crested a rise expecting a view you'd seen before and found something completely different and more magnificent. She could feel the quality of his attention on her like warmth, and she filed it away in the part of herself where she kept things she was not ready to examine, and she turned to discuss the ongoing treatment plan with the doctor. Doctor. Calvert agreed to return in 3 days and left her in charge of the continued treatment in the meantime, which she took as the highest professional compliment he could have offered. He wrote out a prescription for quinine that could be obtained from the general store in Canon Creek as a supplement to her herbal protocol, said, with what appeared to be genuine sincerity, that her case records were among the most thorough he had encountered in the territory, and rode back to Harlow with the particular expression of a man who had been educated in a way he had not anticipated. Delia stayed 3 more days at the Lockhart Ranch. She told herself it was purely medical necessity, and in practical terms this was accurate. Perry's condition required close management through the most dangerous phase of the recovery, and without her presence, Consuelo, capable as she was, would not have been able to manage the complexity of the treatment protocol. But she was also aware, in the private, honest space behind her professionalism, that there was something else keeping her in that quiet sick room with the man in the bed who watched her with that new quality of attention, and who, as he grew stronger, became increasingly interesting to her in ways she was finding it difficult to categorize. They talked during those days more than she had talked to anyone in a long time. It started because she needed his medical history, and he needed something to do that wasn't lying still and being helpless, which she could see was a condition he found nearly unbearable. He answered her medical questions, and then, when she had the information she needed, he kept talking, and she found she didn't stop him. He told her about the ranch, not the public story of its success, which she already knew in outline, but the hidden underside of it, the years of near failure, the drought in 1885 that had killed more of his cattle than he liked to count, the predatory neighbor named Carlyle who had been running his fence line over onto Lockhart land, and who Perry had dealt with through a combination of land survey records, territorial law, and the specific kind of quiet personal confrontation that settled things on the frontier, without anyone having to die. He told her about his hands, the men who worked for him, with the particular care of a man who felt a genuine responsibility for the people in his employ and thought about that responsibility seriously. He did not tell her about his past in Texas, and she did not ask, because she recognized the boundaries people set around their dark places, and she respected those boundaries as she wished her own to be respected. She told him things, too, which surprised her. Not the whole story of Richard Farrow. She was not ready for that and did not know if she would ever be, but the shape of her life before Canon Creek, her mother and the hill country and the long education in plant medicine, the way she had come west and found something that felt, against all expectation, like a place she could be. She told him about her work with a careful enthusiasm that she rarely permitted herself in casual conversation, because she had found that most people heard the words herb woman and stopped genuinely listening, and she had adapted to that by keeping her explanations brief. Perry listened differently. He listened the way she had watched him watch his cattle or his hands or his land, with complete, specific, intelligent attention, as if understanding something properly was worth the time and effort required, and shortcuts in comprehension were not something he was interested in taking. He asked questions that were better than most questions she received, and when she answered them, he absorbed the answers and built on them rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak again. On the second day, she made a mistake she did not recognize as a mistake until afterward. She was preparing a fresh decoction at the small table she'd set up near the window, and she was explaining the properties of the golden seal root, how the berberine compound it contained worked against bacterial infection, how it supported the immune function, why she combined it with yarrow, which she was describing in the same terms, and she was absorbed in the explanation and the work simultaneously. And she did not notice that she had stopped managing her professional distance and was simply talking to him the way she talked to herself when she worked alone, which was to say directly and with no performed simplicity. She turned back from the table with the fresh decoction and found him watching her with an expression so unguarded that it stopped her completely. He looked like a man who had been struck by something beautiful and had not yet decided whether to acknowledge it. She stood with the tin cup in her hand and looked back at him, and the room was very quiet, and the October light came through the south-facing windows and lay across the bed and across his face, and she felt the wall that she had spent 3 years carefully constructing develop what she could only describe as a serious structural concern. "You are remarkable," he said. The directness of it was like everything else about him, unadorned, precisely aimed, with no preamble or softening that would have made it easier to deflect. "I am practical," she said, which was the most effective retreat she had available. "Those two things are not exclusive," he said. She gave him the decoction. "Drink this," she said, "and then try to sleep a little." He drank it without taking his eyes off her, which was impressively difficult to do. "Miss Barrett," he said when she moved to go. "Yes." "When I am recovered," he said carefully, as if he was choosing each word individually, "I would like to talk to you, not as a patient talks to the person treating him." As he paused, "As a man who would like to know you better," the directness of it again. She stood at the doorway and held it very carefully. "You should focus on your recovery," she said. "I am focused on my recovery," he said. "I am also capable of speaking clearly about what I want." She left the room. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall and her composure doing something that it did not ordinarily do, which was to require active management. Then she straightened and went back to the kitchen and told Consuelo what she needed for the next round of treatment. And she was perfectly professional and perfectly capable. And she did not think about what he had said except for the specific intervals when she was unable not to. He recovered. By the end of the third day, his color was entirely normal, his pulse was strong and steady, the fever had broken, and the site of the original wound, which she had been treating with a poultice of comfrey and plantain, was clean and healing properly. Dr. Calvert arrived as promised and confirmed all of it, and pronounced Perry well enough to be up and moving carefully, and restricted him from hard physical labor for another 2 weeks. Perry looked at Delia when the doctor said the 2 weeks part, and the look communicated a number of things, including the fact that he felt this was a serious inconvenience, and the fact that he understood arguing with her about it was not going to be productive, and possibly one or two other things that she chose not to decode in front of the doctor. Dr. Calvert took her aside before he left. "I want to be direct with you about something," he said, with the quality of a man who was about to say something he had been deliberating over. "Please," she said. "The territory is large and the population is growing, and there is not enough medical care to meet the need. There are other settlements like Canon Creek, isolated, underserved, entirely dependent on informal practitioners." He paused. "I have been corresponding with the Territorial Medical Board about the possibility of establishing a formal certification pathway for frontier practitioners, people who can demonstrate the level of knowledge and record-keeping practice that you have shown." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to include your case records in my submission with your permission, and I would like to recommend you specifically as an example of the kind of practice the certification was designed to recognize." She was not often at a loss for words. She was at a loss for words. "I am offering you the possibility of formal recognition," he said, a little more gently. "Not in any distant future. There is a board meeting in the spring. I believe, from what I have seen, that your application would be very strong." "Thank you," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, and that was the only outward sign of what she felt, which was something enormous and long suppressed and deeply personal, because she had been practicing this work for years in the spaces between what was officially acknowledged, and the offer of acknowledgement arrived in her chest like a lamp being lit. Dr. Calvert rode back to Harlow. Delia stood on the porch of the Lockhart ranch in the October afternoon and looked out at the valley and the red ridges beyond it and the vast blue sky over all of it. And she allowed herself, for 3 full minutes, to feel everything she had been carefully not feeling. Then Perry appeared in the doorway behind her. "What did he say?" Perry asked, leaning against the doorframe with the careful posture of a man who was well enough to be up but was obeying instructions. She turned around, and she thought about keeping it contained, and then she told him because he had asked a direct question, and she was not a woman who evaded direct questions. His face when she told him was something she would remember for a long time afterward. It was not merely pleased. It was something more specific and more personal, the expression of someone who felt that something deserved to be recognized had been recognized, and felt this on behalf of someone they had come to care about. He looked at her the way you looked at something you were proud of, and the warmth of it moved through her before she could stop it. "That is exactly right," he said. "That is exactly what should happen." "You do not think it is an unusual occupation for a woman," she said. And she said it directly because she needed to know, because it was not an idle question but one of the foundational questions of her life. "I think it is an unusual occupation," he said, "for any person who has not invested the years of work required to do it at your level. The fact that you are a woman has nothing to do with the quality of the work." She looked at him for a long moment. "Hector said you keep your own records," she said, "financial accounts for the ranch. He said you have never needed an accountant because you could do it better yourself." "I like to understand things completely," he said. "So do I," she said. The quiet between them was different from previous quiets. It had a texture to it, like good ground under the feet, solid, specific, trustworthy. "Miss Barrett," he said. "Delia," she said, which was the first time she had offered it. He received this with the same complete, specific attention he brought to everything. "Delia," he said, as if testing the sound of it. "I said something to you yesterday. Before I ask you to consider it seriously, I want you to understand something." "All right," she said. I do not say things I do not mean," he said. "It is not in my nature to pursue something that I do not intend to follow through on. I wanted you to know that before I said anything further, because I suspect you have encountered men who were not as clear about that distinction." Something shifted in her face. She could feel it, and she knew he saw it. The specific, sharp accuracy of that observation. "Yes," she said. "I thought so," he said, and there was no pity in it, only the acknowledgement of someone who had done the reading and arrived at an understanding. She stood on the porch in the October afternoon and made a decision that was both terrifying and in its bones entirely sound. "You asked to know me better," she said. "Yes. I am not easy to know," she said. "I am told I am remote, that I do not let people in easily. I have been called obstinate," he said, "and difficult." "I do not think you are difficult," she said. "I think you are direct." "There is a difference." "You are not remote," he said. "You are careful, that is also a difference." She looked at the valley again for a moment, then back at him. "I have to go back to town," she said. "I have patients there and I have been away 3 days." "I know," he said, "but I will need to check on you again in 2 days." "I know that too," he said. "So," she said, and she felt the word open in front of her like a gate. "So," he agreed, and the way he said it was warm and steady and absolutely unhurried, like a man who knew what he wanted and had the patience to wait for it to arrive. She rode back to Canon Creek that afternoon and spent the entire ride in a state of internal argument that she found both irritating and, in its stubborn persistence, informative. The argument went like this. She had been hurt before, specifically and significantly, by a man who had used her trust against her. She had built her current life with great care around the specific intention of never being that vulnerable again. She was self-sufficient, professionally capable, and not in need of any attachment that would disrupt the balance she had achieved. She was 30 years old, which was old enough to know that romantic feeling was not the same as good judgment. The counterargument went like this. Perry Lockhart had, in the space of 3 days, demonstrated that he was honest, intelligent, capable of genuine respect for her work, possessed of the specific kind of directness that made deception structurally impossible, and had looked at her. When she was working, when she was explaining something she cared about, when she was simply being herself without performance, in a way that no one had looked at her in a very long time. The argument did not win. 2 days later, she rode back out to the Lockhart ranch with her medical bag and a small, tightly capped bottle of a new tonic she had prepared, and Perry met her on the porch looking considerably more like himself, color in his face. The natural ease returned to his posture, though she was pleased to see he was not yet pushing toward the barn and the work she knew was calling him. "How is the wound site?" she asked, with her professional voice, because she was a professional. "Better," he said. "Come and see." She came and saw. The wound was healing cleanly and well, and she was satisfied, and she updated her case record with the date and the status of the healing. And she was sitting at the table in the kitchen doing this when Consuelo, who had developed, Delia now understood, the specific quality of amusement that people who care about both members of a couple display toward that couple when the couple is still pretending to be purely professional. Brought out 2 cups of coffee and a small plate of pan dulce she had made that morning. "For when you are finished with your work," Consuelo said, with a smile that was warm and entirely deliberate, and left them alone. Delia looked at the coffee and the pan dulce. She looked up at Perry, who was watching her from across the table with an expression that contained the pan dulce situation fully integrated as completely normal and appropriate. She closed her case record. "The certification that Dr. Calvert mentioned," Perry said, after they had each taken their coffee. "Tell me more about what it would mean for your practice." So she told him, and he listened the way he always did, and asked the questions that were always better than most questions. And she found herself talking about things she had kept inside herself for a long time. Her ambitions for the practice, the patterns she had identified in the conditions she treated, the things she believed could be done differently about frontier medical care if anyone had the standing and the resources to do them differently. She talked for a long time, and he did not interrupt and did not check his patience, and when she finally caught herself and said, slightly embarrassed, that she had been going on at length, he said simply that there was nothing in what she'd said that did not deserve the length. He told her in return about the dark past she had suspected, not fully, not all at once, but enough. There had been a woman in Texas 6 years ago before he came to Arizona. There had been a betrayal that was not his, A forced choice that had cost him more than land or money. It had cost him his faith in his own judgment. He had come to Arizona partly to rebuild something and partly to run from the question of whether he still trusted himself to want the right things. 6 years of work had answered the question slowly, incrementally, in the only way that real answers came through time and the accumulated evidence of daily choices made rightly. "You stopped trusting yourself," she said. "Yes. So did I," she said. "I signed documents I should not have signed, and I decided afterward that the lesson was not to trust anyone again." "But you stayed here," he said. "You kept working. You let people depend on you." "That is different," she said. "Professional trust is different from—" She paused. "From this," he said simply. "Yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not aggressively, not demanding, just placed it there, as a statement of presence, as a question asked in a language that did not require words. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They were very still for a moment in the autumn kitchen, with the smell of coffee and pan dulce around them, and the whole vast territory outside the windows going about its business. "I would like to come to town next week," he said. "When the doctor has cleared me for riding, I would like to take you to supper at the hotel." "The hotel in Canon Creek," she said, "serves food that I can only describe as a test of fortitude." "Then we will test our fortitude together," he said. She laughed. She did not do it often, not because she was not capable of it, but because she had lived carefully for a long time, and it came out surprised and real, and she could see from his face that it was the right thing to have happened. "All right," she said. "Supper at the hotel." The weeks that followed were the most confusing and the most quietly joyful of Delia's life since the death of her mother. Perry came to town the following Saturday as promised, with the doctor's clearance and his best hat, and they had supper at the Canon Creek Hotel, which served exactly the food she had predicted, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, with the ease of two people who had already done the hard business of showing each other their real selves and survived it. He walked her home afterward through the cool October night, and at her door he said good night with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything. And she went inside and stood in her kitchen for a long time with her hands flat on the work table and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. He came again the following week, and the week after that, and each time the ease between them deepened into something that she could only describe as essential. The sense that she could not now construct a version of her daily life that did not include the knowledge of his existence and his regard for her as active, present facts rather than background information. He rode out with her on one of her herb-gathering routes, insisting with the cheerful stubbornness she was learning was one of his most characteristic traits that he was perfectly well enough for a gentle ride. She showed him the Mormon tea plants, the desert willow, the sagebrush, the prickly pear, explained the uses and preparations for each, and he paid attention with the particular intelligence that she now understood was simply how he processed everything completely and without shortcuts. When she showed him how to identify a stand of yerba mansa by the creek bed, he crouched down beside her in the red dirt and looked at the plant with the same quality of attention he gave to his fence lines and his cattle records, and she found herself looking at the side of his face in the afternoon light and feeling something so large and uncomplicated that it almost frightened her. Almost. He kissed her for the first time on a November afternoon on the porch of her cabin, the kind of kiss that had been building for weeks through the specific tension of two careful people approaching something they both wanted and both feared. And when it finally happened, it was quiet and unhurried and entirely certain. And she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart, and it was steady and strong, and nothing like the hummingbird pulse she had felt in the red dust weeks ago. And something in her release that she had not known was held. "I have been thinking," he said, against her hair, "about things I would like to say to you. And I keep not saying them because I do not want to move faster than you are ready for." "I appreciate that," she said, "but I also think," he said carefully, "that if I wait for a perfect moment I will wait too long." She leaned back and looked at him. "Say them." "I am in love with you," he said, the same directness he always had, the same absolute, unornamented precision. "I believe I have been since the morning I was well enough to watch you explain Golden Seal to the doctor, and I realized that you were the most extraordinary person I had encountered in 6 years of living in this territory. Possibly longer." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything except the opportunity to continue being in your life in whatever form you will permit." She held this for a moment, the weight and the warmth of it, the way it sat against the architecture of her careful distance, and found, rather than a wall, something that had been quietly transforming into a door. "Perry," she said. "Yes. I need you to understand something about me before." "I understand you," he said. It was said with the same certainty with which he said everything real. "No, listen," she said, because this was important. "I am not going to be a rancher's wife who tends the house. I am going to be a practitioner. I am going to pursue the certification. I am going to have patience, and I am going to continue gathering plants and making medicines and keeping records, and possibly, if Dr. Calvert's effort with the territorial board succeeds, I am going to be doing more of that work than I do now, not less. That is who I am." He looked at her as if she had said something he could not quite follow the logic of. "I know that," he said. "I would not have it any other way." "That is," he stopped, and she could see him trying to say something complex with the vocabulary of a man who preferred precision to eloquence. "That is the thing I love, the specific thing. The work and the mind behind it and the person the mind belongs to. Asking you to put that down would be like," he shook his head. "It would make no sense." She looked at him for a long time in the November afternoon. "I am in love with you too," she said, and it came out without calculation or management, just the plain, unguarded fact of it. He pulled her back against him, and she let him, and the porch boards creaked in the cold, and somewhere down toward the main street someone's dog was barking at something important, and the sky above the canyon was the deep, saturated blue of late autumn, and Delia Barrett, who had come west to outrun a betrayal and had ended up building something real, felt the last residue of the old fear dissolve in the straightforward warmth of being held by someone she trusted absolutely. November became December, and December deepened the cold into the canyon walls and frosted the red rock in the mornings, and they spent time together with the growing ease of two people, building a shared vocabulary, references and jokes, and the specific shorthand of two people who have spent enough time together that communication begins to happen below the level of words. He met her at her cabin on evenings when he was not occupied at the ranch. She came to the ranch on weekends and found her place in the kitchen with Consuelo, who was openly, warmly delighted with the development, and showed it through the medium of particularly excellent meals on the days Delia visited. Hector Vega, who had the particular satisfaction of a man who felt he had played a role in something good by finding Perry's collapsed form in the right part of the range, always had something kind to say to her when she arrived, and the whole atmosphere of the Lockhart ranch, which had always been competent and orderly, took on an additional quality of warmth that Delia noticed and valued. She submitted her documentation to Dr. Calvert in December for the territorial board application, a package that represented 15 years of her life organized into a body of evidence. She wrote a cover letter that Dr. Calvert told her later was the most clearly argued case for frontier medical practice certification he had read, and sent it off with the conscious decision not to attach her sense of worth to its outcome, while privately hoping with considerable force that it would succeed. Perry read the cover letter before she sent it. She had not asked him to, but he had asked if he could, and she had given it to him, and he had read it at the kitchen table with his complete attention, and when he finished he looked up and said that it was exactly right, and that anyone who read it would understand both the argument and the person making it. She had made a small notation in the margin, a tiny asterisk that said nothing, but marked the moment as something she would remember. It was at Christmas, a quiet Christmas, which was how Christmas was in isolated frontier settlements, intimate and homemade rather than grand, that Perry said the rest of what he had been thinking. They were at the ranch. Consuelo had made tamales, and there was a small cedar branch that someone had cut and set in the corner of the main room with a few candles arranged around it. The night was cold enough that the fire in the hearth was doing serious work, and the lamplight was warm and amber, and Delia was sitting on the settee with her feet tucked under her, and a cup of Consuelo's excellent hot chocolate in her hands. And she realized, thoroughly, unguardedly happy in a way that she had not been since she was young enough, that happiness was simply a default condition rather than an achievement. Perry sat down beside her and was quiet for a moment in the way that preceded his real communications, the way she now recognized as him organizing something important. "I have been thinking," he said. "I have noticed," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I want to be specific about what I mean when I say that. I'm not asking you to come and manage my household or to stop your work or to make yourself into anything other than what you are. I am asking whether you want to build something together, the kind of thing that is bigger than either of us separately and also better." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I have a cabin in town," she said. "I know. My patients need to be able to reach me." "The ranch is 2 miles from town," he said. "You can ride 2 miles in 20 minutes. We could also," he paused, considering, "we could build you a proper workspace here, if you wanted, with everything you need for the medicines, and keep a room in town as well for the patients who cannot come out." She looked at him. He had thought this through. Of course he had. He was Perry Lockhart. "Have you discussed this with Hector and Consuelo?" she asked. "No," he said. "I wanted to ask you first. What would they say?" "Consuelo would be very happy," he said. "She has been practicing a kind of gentle campaign on the subject for several weeks." Hector would say in his specific way that it was about time. She laughed, and then she looked at him and she said, "Yes." He looked at her steadily as if verifying that he had heard correctly. "Yes," she said again, "I will marry you. Under those terms, which are the right terms, and because I want to build something with you." He took the hot chocolate out of her hands and put it safely on the side table and then put his arms around her properly, and she leaned into him, and the fire crackled and the candles on the little cedar branch threw their small warm light, and Consuelo appeared briefly in the doorway from the kitchen, looked at them, pressed both hands against her mouth in delight, and disappeared again. They were married in March of 1888, on one of those spectacular Arizona spring days when the desert blooms briefly and extravagantly, and the light has a quality of particular clarity that belongs specifically to that season. The ceremony was in the small church in Canon Creek, performed by a minister who had come through on his circuit and who was clearly charmed by the couple in front of him. The large, quiet rancher who spoke his vows in the same direct and certain way he said everything, and the composed, bright-eyed woman who received them and returned them in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely her own. Mrs. Oglesby cried. Hector and Consuelo stood in the front row, and Consuelo also cried, and Hector put his arm around her with the expression of a man who was also moved, but felt it important to maintain some composure for the record. Dr. Calvert sent a letter, which arrived 3 days before the wedding, stating that the Territorial Board had approved a certification pathway for frontier practitioners, and that Delia Barrett's application was among the first group of cases they would review, and he anticipated, based on the strength of her documentation, a favorable outcome before summer. Delia read this letter twice and then went and found Perry in the barn, which was where he went to think, and she read it to him there among the horses and the smell of hay and the March light coming through the gaps in the barn boards, and he listened, and then he held her face in his hands and looked at her as if she were the most important thing he could see in any direction, which was saying something in a country that had that quality of landscape. "Everything you built," he said. "All of it." "Not by myself," she said. "Most of it," he said. "The most important parts." They moved her practice to the ranch over the following weeks, building a dedicated workspace onto the south side of the main house. A proper room with good light and shelving for her stores, and a sturdy work table, and a small stove for decoctions. She kept her cabin in town, as they had discussed, converting it into a consultation room where her patients could come on the 2 days each week she spent in Canon Creek, and rode the 2 miles each way with a combination of efficiency and pleasure, because the ride itself was always beautiful, and because having something to ride toward made the riding better. The practice grew. The certification came through in July of 1888, making Delia officially the first certified frontier practitioner in the territory, a fact that Dr. Calvert mentioned in a letter to a colleague at the Territorial Medical College, with the particular quiet pride of someone who had helped something important happen. The formal recognition brought patients from settlements further afield, people who had been managing without adequate care, and who came to her with conditions that ranged from the urgent to the long-standing, and she treated all of them with the same focused, intelligent care she had always brought to her work, and she kept her records, and she continued writing letters to botanists and physicians, and anyone she could find who was building the body of knowledge she drew from. The ranch continued to be what Perry had built it to be, productive and competent, and managed with the kind of serious attention that made things last. He hired 2 new hands that summer and began the fencing project he had been planning for 2 years, expanding the range in a direction that the Territorial Survey now clearly established as his, after the final resolution of the old boundary dispute with the neighbor Carlisle, who had eventually conceded the surveyed line with the particular gracelessness of a man who had been proven wrong and did not enjoy the experience. They worked alongside each other in the way that 2 capable, independent people worked alongside each other, not dissolved into a single entity, but made individually stronger by the presence of a foundation that held steady while each of them built upward. She watched him at his work sometimes and felt the same quality of admiration she had always had for competence and seriousness, now deepened by the specific, warm knowledge of who he was underneath the competence. He watched her at hers and looked the way he had looked that morning when the fever broke, and she was explaining Golden Seal to the doctor, surprised and proud and deeply, specifically glad. In the autumn of 1888, a year after she had found him in the red dust by the creek, Delia realized she was expecting a child. She told him on a clear October evening on the porch of their house, the same porch where she had stood almost exactly a year ago, looking at the valley and feeling the wall around her developing its first serious crack. She told him with the same plain directness she brought to all real things, and she watched his face and saw the sequence. First the understanding of what she had said, then something complicated and large moving through him, and then the expression that settled over everything else, which was the specific, absolute happiness of a man who had built something real and was now watching it grow. He held her for a long time without saying anything, and the canyon wall across the valley caught the last light of the day and went the color of burned copper, and the sky above it was indigo and vast, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong, nothing like it had been that terrible afternoon in the red dust when she had first put her fingers to his pulse and felt what she felt. "Are you frightened?" he asked, eventually. "A little," she said honestly. "You?" "A little," he said. "Good," she said. "That means we are paying attention." He made a sound that was something between a laugh and an agreement, and tightened his arms, and she closed her eyes, and the evening settled around the ranch, the way evenings did in that country, completely, warmly, without reservation. Their son was born in the early summer of 1889, in the workspace Delia had built onto the south side of the house, with Consulo's assistance and Dr. Calvert present, who had made the 22-mile ride without being asked, because he had been following Delia's work and her certification and her practice for over a year and felt, with the gruff affection that sometimes grew between colleagues who respected each other, that he wanted to be there. The birth was uncomplicated, which Delia attributed to thorough preparation and good management, and Dr. Calvert attributed to thorough preparation and good management, and Consuelo attributed to everything being exactly as it was meant to be, which was a perspective that covered all the bases adequately. They named the boy James, after her father, whose land she had lost but whose name she had always carried carefully. Perry's face when he held the baby was something she would carry inside herself for the rest of her life. The absolute, almost uncomprehending quality of that specific joy. The way a man who had spent 6 years building a life against an inner grief finally looked when he understood that the grief was finished. James Lockhart grew up between the ranch and the practice, a child who could identify yarrow and golden seal by sight before he could write his own name, who rode competently by 3 years old, who had his father's serious attention and his mother's quick intelligence, and who combined these traits in ways that were sometimes startling and frequently delightful. Hector and Consuelo treated him as a kind of shared grandchild, which he received with the equanimity of a child who has always been well loved and takes the warmth of adults for granted in the best possible way. The second child, a girl they named Rosa, came 2 years after James and brought with her a quality of exuberant motion that James had never exhibited, dragging her brother into adventures from the moment she could walk, developing early opinions about everything, and establishing herself within the ranch community as a force of considerable personality. Delia's certification continued to open doors. She was invited to contribute to a territorial medical publication in 1890, the first piece under her name that had any official standing, and she wrote about the integration of plant medicine with conventional frontier medical practice in terms that were precise and careful and entirely free of the defensive hedging that women writing in professional publications in 1890 frequently felt necessary. Perry read the draft and said, as he said about everything she wrote, that it was exactly right. Dr. Calvert retired in 1891 and recommended his replacement, a younger man named Harris, newly arrived from Cincinnati, consult with Delia as a matter of priority, which the young doctor. Harris did, and found in her a colleague who compressed 20 years of practical frontier experience into explanations he could use immediately, and was grateful accordingly. She treated hundreds of patients across those years, and she kept records of all of them, and the body of knowledge she accumulated about frontier medicine in the Arizona Territory became, over time, something that mattered beyond the immediate moments of healing, a resource that other practitioners consulted, a foundation that supported more care for more people in more places than she could ever reach herself. Perry expanded the ranch twice more in the years that followed, each expansion the result of careful planning and patient work rather than speculation or luck, and the Lockhart Ranch became one of the most substantial operations in the territory. Not the largest, because he had never been interested in scale for its own sake, but the most consistently productive and the best managed, and the one with the best reputation for the treatment of its hands, which Perry considered at least as important as any other metric. There were hard years, a drought in 1893 that tested the ranch's resources in ways that required serious decisions, a fever that swept through the territory in 1891 that Delia worked through with almost no sleep for 3 weeks, treating case after case with the grim efficiency of someone who understood exactly what the stakes were. A legal challenge to the northern boundary of the Lockhart land from a speculative land company that sent lawyers from Phoenix and was eventually defeated through the combination of Perry's meticulous records and a territorial court judge who had the old-fashioned respect for documented fact that good judges always had. Through all of it they were each other's ground, the fixed point that the other navigated by. When the drought was worst, she sat with him in the evenings and talked through the resource management with the same analytical intelligence she brought to her medical cases, and her perspective was sometimes the one that found the path through. When the fever was at its worst, and she was exhausted past the point of clear thinking. He was the one who appeared with coffee and food, and the specific, quiet presence that did not demand anything, only offered to hold the weight for a little while so she could rest. She thought sometimes about the afternoon in the dust, about what had happened in those 2 hours before the riders came, not with the drama of near tragedy revisited, but with a kind of wonder at the structure of things, the improbable, precise way that 2 people could arrive at the same point in the same landscape at the same moment, and find something neither had been looking for and both had needed. She had been gathering Mormon tea on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1887, because that was when the seed pods were at their best, and he had been riding back from the northern fence line, because there had been a break that needed inspection, and the creek ran east to west through the middle of both their routes, and the fever had been building in him for 4 days, and she had been 40 yards away when his body finally conceded what his will had been refusing to admit. All of it had to be true simultaneously for any of the rest of it to happen. She mentioned this to him once, on a winter evening much later when the children were asleep and the fire was good and the wind was doing its work outside without them needing to participate. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "How precise it had to be." "I think about it too," he said. "Are you grateful?" she asked, meaning for the precision, for the chain of small accidents that had led to everything. He looked at her with the directness he always had, the look that never varied because it came from somewhere that did not change. "Every day," he said. She leaned against him, and the fire spoke in its quiet language, and the wind outside was cold and the house was warm, and somewhere upstairs James and Rosa were sleeping the complete, trusting sleep of children who have never had reason to be anything else. The year was 1895. The Arizona Territory was still several years from statehood, but was changing, deepening, filling in the map between its rough early edges. Canon Creek had grown into a town of some permanence, with a schoolhouse and a proper general store and a telegraph office and the beginnings of a bank. The Red Canyon walls to the north were the same as they had always been, because they had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. Delia's practice had grown into something that would outlast her students who had come to learn from her, methods that had been written down and published, a certification pathway that had been used by practitioners across 3 territories. The herb woman of Canon Creek had become something that no single title could hold, and she wore it with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had built something real and did not need to explain it. Perry Lockhart at 41 was much the same as Perry Lockhart at 32, large and quiet and utterly direct, except that the quality of the stillness in him had changed from the stillness of someone holding old grief in place to the stillness of someone who had simply arrived at a life that fit. The grief was gone, not removed but resolved, the way a deep wound resolved into a scar that told the truth about what had happened without continuing to hurt. They sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the canyon walls change color in the late light, and talked about the things that needed talking about, and were sometimes silent together with the complete ease of 2 people who had been through enough together that silence was no longer something that needed to be managed. Their daughter Rosa was 5, and had recently developed the opinion that she would be a horse trainer when she grew up, which Delia regarded with the specific, recognizing warmth of a woman who understood what it felt like to know from an early age what you were built for. James at 7 was already helping with the ranch accounts in small ways, displaying his father's particular aptitude for the kind of careful numerical thinking that made systems work. There would be more years, more work, more hard seasons, more of the incremental cumulative building of something that lasted. There would be a 3rd child. They both suspected that possibility was in the air between them already, soft and unspoken and not yet urgent, but present. What there would not be was uncertainty about the foundation of it. That had been settled on a November afternoon on a porch in the cold, and then settled again at a Christmas fire, and then again in March of 1888 before a small-town minister, with the territory-specific late winter light coming through the church windows. And again, in the thousand daily moments of two people choosing each other clearly and without condition. The herb woman and the rancher. The woman who had come west to outrun a dark past and found instead something that made her want to stay. The man who had built a life against his grief and found in her the proof that building could turn into belonging. Two careful people who had, in the end, been braver than they had intended and found in that courage everything they had needed. The canyon held them. The territory held them. The vast, indifferent, secretly magnificent Arizona sky held everything above them in the blue certainty of late afternoon, the same sky that had looked down on a woman kneeling in the red dust 2 miles north, pressing 2 fingers against the neck of an unconscious man and deciding that he was going to live. She had been right. As she generally was, Perry would have told you so himself.